Thanksgiving dinner was supposed to be a night filled with laughter, warm memories, and the comfort of family. But in the middle of passing the mashed potatoes, my Aunt Lila suddenly stopped talking, looked straight at me, and said, "You deserve to know the truth about your mother." Her voice was calm, but there was something in her tone that sent a chill down my spine. I froze, my fork hovering in midair, and felt every pair of eyes turn toward us. My mother's hands stiffened around her glass. My father's expression darkened, and my younger brother shifted uncomfortably in his seat. In that moment, I knew this wasn't just another holiday argument. Whatever she was about to say had the power to change everything I thought I knew about my family. It was a crisp November evening in upstate New York, the kind where the air outside feels sharp, but the inside of the old farmhouse is glowing with warmth. The dining room was alive with the smell of roasted turkey, buttery rolls, and cinnamon pie cooling on the counter. I had driven up from Boston the night before, eager for a break from the city and excited to be back with my family. My grandfather, Robert, sat at the head of the table, his silver hair neatly combed and his deep voice guiding most of the conversation. Beside him was my mother, Elaine, a graceful woman in her late 50s with soft eyes and a quiet presence. She had always been the calm in the storm, the one who avoided conflict, but I often wondered what went on beneath her composed surface. My father, Daniel, was across from her, carving the turkey with his usual precision, a habit he took pride in every Thanksgiving. My younger brother, Evan, sat next to me, grinning as he tried to sneak an extra bread roll without anyone noticing. And then there was Aunt Lila, my mother's younger sister, positioned at the far end of the table. She was bold and outspoken, the kind of person who didn't shy away from saying exactly what she thought, even when it made people uncomfortable. She and my mother were opposites in almost every way, and I had seen plenty of tense moments between them over the years. The meal had started with the usual chatter, jokes about past Thanksgivings, playful arguments over which pie was the best, and my grandfather's old stories about how things used to be. The candles flickered softly, casting a golden glow over the table, and for a while, everything felt exactly as it should. I had no reason to think that this night would be any different from the others we had shared. But then, Aunt Lila set her fork down, leaned slightly forward, and spoke the words that would change the rest of the evening and my life. Aunt Lila's words hung in the air, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall. My mother didn't look up. She kept her eyes fixed on her plate, her fork moving aimlessly through the mashed potatoes. My father shifted in his chair, clearing his throat like he was about to speak, but then he pressed his lips together and stayed silent. The tension was thick, like we had all just stepped onto dangerous ground, and no one knew which way to move. I looked from one face to another, trying to make sense of the sudden change in the room. "What truth?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. My mother's shoulders tensed. Aunt Lila leaned back slightly, but her eyes stayed locked on me. "It's about a time in your mother's life that you've never been told about," she said, her tone steady, almost defiant. My stomach tightened. I had grown up thinking I knew my mother's story, where she came from, the challenges she'd faced, the choices she made. I'd always believed that the picture she painted for us was complete, but the way Aunt Lila said it made it sound like I'd been looking at a puzzle with half the pieces missing. My mother finally spoke, her voice quiet. "Lila, not now. This is not the time." My father nodded in agreement, his hand reaching under the table toward her as if to give her strength. But Lila wasn't backing down. "When is the time, Elaine? You've kept this from her for 30 years. She's not a child anymore. She has a right to know." The words hit me hard. 30 years. That was my entire lifetime. Evan glanced at me, eyebrows raised, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. He looked just as confused as I felt. "What's going on?" he asked, directing the question to no one in particular. No one answered. My grandfather's deep voice finally cut through the silence. "Elaine," he said slowly, "you can't keep carrying this forever. Sooner or later, the truth comes out." His words carried weight, the kind of weight that comes from having lived long enough to know how secrets can poison a family. I leaned forward, my heart pounding. "Mom, what are they talking about?" She shook her head, her eyes glistening like she was holding back tears. "It's nothing you need to worry about," she said, but her voice cracked on the last word. That crack told me everything. It was definitely something I needed to worry about. I felt my frustration rising. "You can't say that and expect me to just drop it," I said. "If it's about me, I want to hear it." Aunt Lila folded her arms, almost like she was bracing herself. "It's about the night you were born," she said, and immediately I felt my breath catch in my chest. My mother's eyes closed briefly, as if the words were too heavy to hear. My father sat rigid, his jaw tight, staring down at his plate, like he could will himself into disappearing. The night I was born was never a mystery to me. I had been told the same sweet story every year, how my mother went into labor late at night, how my father rushed her to the hospital, how my grandfather cried when he held me for the first time. It was a happy story, one that always made me feel loved and wanted. But now, hearing Aunt Lila say there was another version, a hidden one, made my skin prickle. My mother tried to stop her. "Lila, please." But Aunt Lila's voice grew firmer. "She deserves to know that her birth wasn't the picture-perfect story you've been feeding her. She deserves to know where you really were that night and why." The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. My brother put down his fork, his eyes darting between all of us. "Wait, what do you mean where she really was?" he asked. Lila looked at him briefly, then turned her gaze back to me. "Your mother wasn't at the hospital when you were born. Not at first. And your father didn't even know you were coming that night." My father's head snapped up, his voice sharp. "That's enough, Lila." But there was something in his eyes, guilt, maybe, that made me feel like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. I couldn't stop now. I needed to know what they were hiding. "Mom," I said, my voice low but steady. "Is that true?" She didn't answer right away. Her fingers twisted in her lap, her lips trembling. My grandfather leaned forward, his voice softer this time. "Elaine, she's asking you. You can't protect her from the truth forever." My mother's eyes met mine for the first time that evening. They were full of pain, but also something else, fear. "Yes," she whispered, barely audible. The air in the room shifted. I could feel the weight of every unspoken detail pressing down on me. My heart raced, not knowing what was coming next, but certain that whatever it was would change everything I thought I knew about my life. The moment my mother whispered that single word, the entire room seemed to shift. Yes, it was true. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out the faint sounds of silverware against plates and the soft hum of conversation from the living room where the younger cousins were playing. Everyone at the table seemed frozen, as if waiting for someone else to take the next step. My father's hands were clenched on either side of his plate, his knuckles pale. My grandfather sat motionless, his gaze locked on my mother like he was silently urging her to keep going. Aunt Lila leaned forward, her expression unreadable, as if she knew the storm was about to break wide open. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. "If you knew this was true, why didn't you ever tell me?" My mother's eyes flickered toward my father, and for a brief moment, I thought she might stay silent again. But something in her face shifted, like a small crack had formed in the wall she had built for decades, and it was finally starting to crumble. "Because," she said slowly, her voice uneven, "I wanted to protect you from the pain of knowing how you came into this world. I thought, maybe, if I kept it buried, it would never matter." The weight of her words sank into me. I pushed my chair back slightly, the legs scraping against the wooden floor, the sound making everyone flinch. "It matters now," I said, my voice firmer. "I need to know what happened. I'm not a child. You can't decide what parts of my life I get to know." My father suddenly spoke, his tone sharp. Claire, your mother had her reasons. I turned to him, feeling the heat rise in my chest. Then why don't you tell me? Or do you not want me to know either? His jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. My mother's hands trembled as she reached for her glass of water, her fingers barely able to grip it. She took a small sip, set it down, and let out a slow breath. If I tell you, she said, her voice breaking slightly, you have to understand that I was scared. I was so young, and I didn't know what to do. Scared of what? I asked, leaning in. Of who? The question hung between us like a live wire. My mother's gaze shifted again toward my father, and that was when I realized there was more to his silence than just discomfort. He knew exactly what she was afraid of. Aunt Lila's voice cut in, firm and unapologetic. She was scared of him, she said, nodding toward my father. The words landed like a slap. My father's face flushed, and his voice rose. That's not true, Lila. You don't know the whole story. She shot him a cold look. I know enough. I could feel my heart pounding faster, my breath coming in shorter bursts. Mom, I said again, softer. This time, please just tell me. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded faintly, as if she had just made the decision to finally let it all out. She straightened in her chair, her hands folding neatly in her lap, and looked directly at me. The night you were born, she began, I wasn't at the hospital. I was miles away in a women's shelter. I didn't tell anyone except your grandfather. I didn't want anyone else to know. Not even him. The room went so quiet. I could hear the faint whistle of the wind against the windows. My father opened his mouth as if to speak, but my mother held up her hand to stop him. You had been coming sooner than expected, she continued, and I was already planning to leave. I had packed a bag and was ready to go because I couldn't stay in the house anymore. I was afraid. Her voice cracked on the last word, and a tear slid down her cheek. I could barely process what I was hearing. My whole life, the story had been about a joyful rush to the hospital, about excitement and anticipation. But now, a darker image began to take shape. A young woman, pregnant, terrified, hiding in a shelter instead of surrounded by loved ones. Why were you afraid? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, glancing again at my father, who sat stiffly, his face unreadable. Because, she said quietly, the night before, we had a fight, and it wasn't the first time he'd lost his temper, but it was the first time I thought he might actually hurt me. The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. My stomach churned, and a wave of nausea washed over me. I stared at my father, searching for any sign of denial or remorse. He said nothing. My mother took another deep breath, her eyes still fixed on mine. I planned to stay at the shelter until I figured out what to do, but when the contractions started, I panicked. I didn't want to have you there, so I called my father and he drove me to the hospital. I didn't call Daniel until after you were born. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Shock, sadness, anger, all swirling together so fast I could barely sort them out. This was the turning point. There was no going back to the version of my family I thought I knew. I was looking at my mother not just as my parent, but as a woman who had lived through something I never imagined. And now that she had opened this door, I needed to know everything on the other side. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The weight of my mother's words pressed down on all of us, making the air in the dining room feel heavy and still. My mind was racing. Every memory I had of my family felt like it had been cracked open, revealing something raw and unfamiliar underneath. I had grown up believing my parents had built their life together on a foundation of love and stability, but now I was looking at a truth that was jagged and painful. My father's silence was no longer just uncomfortable, it was damning. I took a slow breath and looked straight at him. Is that true? My voice shook, not from fear, but from the force of needing an answer. His jaw tightened, his eyes flicking toward my mother and then back to me. I don't remember it the way she's telling it, he said finally, his tone controlled but cold. We argued, yes, but it was nothing like she's making it sound. Aunt Lila let out a bitter laugh. Of course you'd say that, she said. You've been rewriting history for decades. My father glared at her, his voice rising. And you've been inserting yourself into things that aren't your business. My mother's voice broke through their bickering, sharper than I had ever heard it. Stop, both of you. This is not about your fight, Lila. This is about me finally telling the truth to my daughter. She turned back to me, and I could see her gathering the strength to keep going. Her hands were trembling, but her eyes were steady. What your father doesn't want to admit, she said, her voice low but clear, is that I left that night because I didn't feel safe. I'd seen signs before, things I told myself weren't as bad as they felt. But that night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had bruises, Claire, on my arms, on my side, and I couldn't bring you into a home where I was afraid of what might happen. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. My throat tightened, and my vision blurred for a second. I had never in my life heard my mother speak about being hurt. She had always seemed unshakable, the one who kept the peace no matter what. The thought of her being vulnerable, of her hiding pain from me all these years, made my stomach twist. My father's face flushed a deep red. You're twisting this, he snapped. You know I would never hurt her like that. We were young, we argued, and things got heated. That's all. My grandfather, who had been silent until now, slammed his hand down on the table. The sharp sound made us all jump. Enough, Daniel, he said in a voice that was both controlled and furious. I saw her that night. I saw the bruises. I was the one who drove her to that shelter. Don't you dare stand here and pretend it didn't happen. The room went deathly quiet. My father looked down, his lips pressed into a thin line. My mother's shoulders sagged, as if a weight she'd been carrying for decades had finally shifted. But the effort of speaking it aloud had drained her. She reached for her water again, her hand shaking as she brought it to her lips. I tried to speak, but my voice came out as a whisper. Why didn't you ever tell me? All these years, I thought we were normal. I thought you were happy. My mother's eyes softened, and for the first time that night, she looked like she might break. Because I didn't want you to grow up thinking you came from violence. I didn't want that to be your story. I wanted you to feel safe, even if it meant hiding the truth from you. And I thought if I stayed, if I managed it, you'd never have to know. Her words cut deep. She had stayed. She had endured. And she had carried this secret just to protect me from it. But in doing so, she had also erased a part of herself from my life. A part that now felt like it defined everything. Then Aunt Lila leaned in, her voice quieter but still sharp. That's not all she's not telling you. My mother closed her eyes, her lips tightening as if bracing herself. I turned to Lila, my heart pounding. What else? Lila looked at me with a mix of pity and resolve. Your mother didn't just go to the shelter to get away from your father. She went because she was planning to leave for good. She had a bus ticket in her bag and a place to stay in another state. You were going to be born, and he wasn't supposed to know where. My mother opened her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks. It's true, she said softly. I was ready to disappear, but when you came earlier than expected, everything changed. I thought, maybe I could make it work if I stayed. Maybe he'd change. I convinced myself it was worth trying. For you. My chest felt heavy, my mind trying to process the weight of it all. The story I had been told about my birth was gone, replaced by something more complicated, more painful, and far more real. I looked around the table at the faces of my family, my father's, tense and unyielding, my mother's, raw with vulnerability, my grandfather's, etched with old anger, Lila's, fierce and unflinching. And I realized nothing would ever be the same after tonight. After the last words were spoken, the table remained silent. No one reached for another bite of food. The turkey sat untouched, the mashed potatoes had gone cold, and the candles on the table flickered as if they too felt the unease that had settled over the room. I sat there, staring at my plate, my thoughts running wild. Everything I thought I knew about my family had been torn apart in the span of one dinner. My chest felt tight, and I couldn't tell if it was anger, sadness, or disbelief. I glanced at my father. He kept his eyes down, his fork motionless. For years, I had seen him as the steady one, the provider, the person who kept our family functioning. Now I was wrestling with the idea that there was another side to him, a side I had been shielded from my entire life. It was like realizing there had always been a shadow following us, but I had never turned around to look at it until now. My mother's eyes were still wet, but her expression had shifted. She didn't look afraid anymore. Tired, yes, but there was a quiet strength there, the kind that comes after years of carrying something too heavy and finally setting it down. She reached across the table, her hand brushing mine, and whispered, "I'm sorry. You had to hear it this way." Her voice cracked, but there was a sincerity in it that I knew came from deep within her. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to let her know that I understood she had done what she thought was best. But another part of me wanted to scream, to ask why I had been kept in the dark for so long. Instead, I just nodded slightly, not trusting my voice to hold steady. Aunt Lila broke the silence first, leaning back in her chair with a sigh. Secrets like this don't disappear. They just wait for the right moment to come out. She looked at my mother, her tone softer than before. "You did what you thought you had to do. I just wish you'd told her sooner." My grandfather nodded slowly, his gaze moving from my mother to me. "Families survive a lot of things," he said, "but they don't survive lies forever. The truth has a way of finding daylight." Those words stayed with me. The truth had found daylight tonight, and it had burned away the picture-perfect story I had believed for so long. I could feel the weight of that truth pressing against me, demanding to be acknowledged, even if it hurt. Evan, who had been quiet for most of the exchange, finally spoke up. "I don't know how to feel about any of this," he admitted. "It's weird to think about Mom going through something like that, and us not knowing." His honesty was almost comforting. It reminded me that I wasn't alone in my confusion. Dinner eventually resumed in a quiet, mechanical way. People took small bites, but no one really tasted the food. The atmosphere had shifted permanently. There was no going back to laughter and small talk, no pretending that what had just been said could be unsaid. When the plates were cleared, I stayed behind in the dining room, helping my mother stack dishes. She moved slowly, her hands lingering on the china as if grounding herself in the familiarity of the task. I finally broke the silence between us. "You don't have to apologize for what happened," I said quietly, "but I need you to promise me something. No more secrets. Not like this." She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine. Then she nodded. "No more secrets," she said. Her voice was steady this time, and I believed her. As I helped her carry the last of the dishes into the kitchen, I thought about how the night had started, warm, familiar, and full of tradition, and how it had ended, stripped bare and raw. Yet, strangely, I felt something I hadn't expected. I felt closer to my mother, not because the truth was easy, but because it was real. And real, even when it hurts, is better than the comfort of a lie. Later that night, as I lay in bed in my childhood room, I stared at the ceiling and thought about the generations before me. How many other stories had been buried? How many other truths had been hidden to keep the illusion of harmony? I realized then that families aren't defined by their secrets, but by how they face them when they come to light. That Thanksgiving would never be remembered for the food or the decorations. It would be remembered as the night the truth finally surfaced. It didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the hurt. But it opened a door to something we had never really had before: honesty. And maybe, in time, honesty could be the start of healing. When I finally closed my eyes, I knew I would never forget the way my mother's voice sounded when she said, "I'm not afraid anymore." Those words were more than a confession. They were a declaration. And for the first time, I believed her.